The 8 bodybuilding mandatory poses: front double biceps, front lat spread, side chest, rear double biceps, rear lat spread, side triceps, abs and thighs, and most muscular. Fans and athletes all know what they are, but where did they come from? I recently received this question from 2 times Arnold Classic champion Terence Ruffin and one of this year's favourites to win the Classic Physique Olympia crown. It got me thinking, and although I vaguely answered him, I thought it would be a great idea to create a video about this. But in order to do this required a deep dive into the history of posing and bodybuilding competition. And in this video we are going to look at the history behind posing and the 8 mandatory poses that are essential to master for bodybuilding competition. To answer this question, of course, it is essential to look at the history of posing itself, how and when prejudging came about and became a compulsory round, as well as the origin of the 8 mandatory poses. First, let's look at posing. If I was to pose the question, who was the first bodybuilder to invent posing, most would answer Eugene Sandow. I am sure many of you have seen the 1903 footage of Sandow strutting his stuff on the podium. And although Eugene Sandow was definitely the first bodybuilder and the first to advocate posing and popularize it, he definitely was not the first strongman to pose. In fact, there are earlier accounts of strongmen, such as Hippolyte Triat of France, conducting physique exhibitions as far back as 1834. Charles Vansittart was posing in saloons in the late 1800s, as was Gustav Fristensky. John Atkinson of the London Athletic Union ran a weightlifting show with a physique exhibition in 1898 that was won by Launceston Elliot. Back to Sandow. Examining Sandow's 1903 exhibition, we see a flurry of poses being hit by Sandow, including a most muscular and rear double biceps pose. However, the rest of the mandatory poses we are accustomed to seeing are missing. Sure, Sandow was not participating in a bodybuilding competition, but was giving a posing exhibition. But it begs the question, what are the other poses he is hitting? And why does he perform an athletic backflip at the end? Sandow was definitely putting on a show, but it was unlike any show we see in bodybuilding today. What Sandow was actually performing was known as a muscle control display. Muscle control, you ask? Yep, muscle control. This form of physical culture training was quite popular back in the Bronze Era and is said to have been first created by Max Seek, a German strongman who early in life was constantly sick. In the early 1890s, Max Seek created a series of muscle control exercises to develop his health and physique without the use of weights. Later, this system was known as Maxalding and popularized in the early 1900s through the publication of his first book titled Muscle Control by Max Seek. Now, whether Max Seek really invented muscle control or not really doesn't matter. However, what does matter is what is found within this little historical book. Flicking through the pages, we see a scantily dressed Max Seek with great muscular development and definition, displaying different muscular controls, and some very much appeared to look like some of the standard poses as well as 8 mandatory bodybuilding poses of today. Muscle control or maxalding was the practice of gaining control of one's muscles, essentially learning to establish a mind-muscle connection, and in doing so, one could voluntarily contract and relax individual or groups of muscles at will. Looking at Max Seek's book on muscle control, we see the following muscle controls. On page 21, we see Max Seek posing relaxed, facing the front, and on the page thereafter, a back relaxed pose. He then stands in a semi-relaxed pose, contracting his musculature. much like today's relaxed pose. Then the posing begins. Rear lat spreads, most muscular, side chest, the vacuum pose, rear double biceps, side triceps, single biceps, and at the back of the book, abs and thighs. His later Maxalding course follows with even more muscle controls and became very popular thanks to his student Billy Ralph and others hitting awesome muscle controls like this front double biceps, most muscular pose, and a pose which could be confused with the rear double biceps pose. Bobby Pandeur, the poor man's Sandow, also was well known for his incredible muscularity and development thanks to muscle control. No doubt, the development promised and displayed through the practice of muscle control made it a very popular physical culture practice. And although you might think that I just cracked the mystery behind who invented the 8 mandatory poses, I would ask you to bear with me a little longer. Flicking through the pages of old Silver Era mags from the 1930s, 40s and 50s, it is obvious that muscle control and Maxalding courses were very popular. So popular, in fact, was that if you wanted to compete in a physique show, you needed to be a Maxaldist, a term indicating that you were a practitioner of muscle control or a muscle control artist, so to speak. Looking at the footage that exists of the earliest physique shows, we see bodybuilders posing on stage, following in the footsteps of Eugene Sandow, performing a series of muscle controls, flexing their biceps, chest and lats, even performing more daring muscle controls like vacuums and abdominal controls. And one can therefore surmise that muscle control was indeed the progenitor to the 8 mandatory poses. So if Max Seek invented muscle control, and this eventually led to the 8 mandatory poses, how did they end up in bodybuilding competition? Well, definitely through posing, but a better formulated question is how these 8 mandatory poses ended up in the pre-judging phase. Well, to answer this last but very important question, we need to look at the history of bodybuilding competition, in particular, the history of the pre-judging phase. In 1901, the Great Competition took place and was organized by Eugene Sandow, and is regarded by many scholars to be the very first bodybuilding competition in history. And believe it or not, the rules of bodybuilding competition, including a very rudimentary form of prejudging, was already set in place. The qualification process began in 1898 when Eugene Sandow invited potential competitors to send in photographs and vital statistics for initial judging. Those who were shortlisted from this initial phase then competed in regional qualification events before the final competition at the Royal Albert Hall. Therefore, prejudging initially served to narrow down the competitors, much like qualifying competitions or pro cards do today. Photos of the Great Competition reveal bodybuilders lining up, all performing front double biceps in front of the judges, including Sandow. However, unlike the prejudging of modern competition today, in the Great Competition of 1901, competitors were judged on differing physical criteria, such as overall development, balance, tissue tone, and general health, with a strong emphasis on achieving the ideal of a perfect specimen of physical manhood, rather than being freaks or mass monsters. These criteria of judging would continue to be used several decades later in the AAU Mr. America competitions. In the 1940s and 50s, the AAU Mr. America was the most coveted prize in bodybuilding, and although considered a bodybuilding contest, judging was not purely decided by who had the best physique. Judging was quite different back then, and points were assigned for muscularity, symmetry, posing, and general appearance, which included the appearance of your skin, grooming, and posture. The idea was to choose the best representative to be Mr. America, that is, the all-American boy. And for this reason, factors like your face, personality, education, presentation, and social standing were also taken into account. However, competitions were usually held in conjunction with Olympic weightlifting competitions, which meant that they were not so well organized. Regardless, prejudging was held typically before the bodybuilding shows as to allow judges enough time to assess each physique. As you probably have realized, we still have not answered the question as to when the first ever prejudging occurred with mandatory poses, and I promise you that we are getting there. Actually, we have just arrived. After doing a deep dive into the history of bodybuilding competitions, I found out that the NABBA Mr. Universe competitions used prejudging early on in its history. Take these images from the NABBA Mr. Universe in the early 1950s, and you will not only see competitors lined up being compared in front and side relaxed poses, but also being compared in the side chest pose, indicating that mandatory poses were already in place for judging bodybuilding competitions as early as the 1950s. However, footage shows that the standard 8 mandatory poses were not in place yet, as is clear in this footage showing competitors all performing a single biceps pose, which is not a mandatory pose. Looking further into the history of bodybuilding competitions, I found out that the first ever record of a prejudging at an AAU Mr. America occurred in the 1961 AAU Mr. America. However, it did not include the 8 mandatory poses. To quote the article from Iron Man, September 1961, "This was the first year of prejudging, and no advanced planning or thinking had apparently been done. It was a little rough and ragged in procedure, but this should be greatly improved by next year." Competitors were first interviewed about their education and other questions to judge their speaking ability and personality. Further, they received points for their athletic ability, that is, their sporting ability or ability in Olympic weightlifting. The judges would then compare the men's physiques in relaxed, front, side, and back positions. The competitors would of course then pose off later. The 1962 AAU Mr. America followed suit, continuing with prejudging and referencing the IFBB, which also used prejudging to help determine the winners of the contest. But once again, only 3 poses were used in the prejudging, including a front, side, and back pose. Fast forwarding and looking at the existing photography and video footage of NABBA Mr. Universe in the 1960s, we see that in 1965, side chest poses and other mandatory poses were also being used, but it is unsure as to whether the 8 mandatory poses were yet in place. Interestingly, an interview with Larry Scott later in his life confirms the lack of a structured prejudging with mandatory poses, even in the mid-1960s.
Right.
Absolutely. Tell me what it was like at that first Mr. Olympia, winning the whole experience.
How much time do you have?
How much time do you have? As much as it's going to take.
Well, it was a little different then. You're probably too young to know that, you are. But then they didn't have prejudging. The audience decided who was the winner. And so you really played to the audience, and the audience would applaud and give the judges their I don't want to say that the judges didn't have to make up their own opinions, but when the audience response is a lot of the judging, then you really got a lot more enthusiasm from the audience than you do today.
That's right. The first Mr. Olympia in 1965 still didn't have mandatory poses. However, prejudging was already taken up by the IFBB in the early 1960s in competitions such as the IFBB Mr. America and Mr. Universe, with some mandatory posing. Although you might be thinking that all hope is lost, I believe I did not fail in my mission, as the first indication of a prejudging with 8 mandatory poses in my research has to be during the NABBA 1967 Mr. Universe. Here we see Arnold facing off with Dennis Tenorino in a side triceps pose comparison, then a most muscular, a side chest pose, as well as front double biceps and most muscular poses, all during the pre-judging. And if you want to know how I know this was the pre-judging phase, well, it's because of the white sheet behind the competitors, as pre-judging in the NABBA Mr. Universe was typically done away from the crowds earlier before the show in a private room with a white sheet as a background. Coinciding with the changes within NABBA, in 1968 a milestone was achieved. At the 1968 AAU convention in Las Vegas, the National Committee approved a proposal to remove athletic points from the AAU Mr. America. That is, weightlifting points were removed from the AAU Mr. America, meaning the Mr. America would finally be treated as a physique contest, and competitors were to be judged on muscular development alone. Whether WIDA's IFBB incorporated the 8 mandatory poses in its pre-judging before or after NABBA is unclear, but by the 1970s, mandatory poses were part of the IFBB's Mr. America, Mr. Universe and Mr. Olympia competitions. Early footage from 1974 sees bodybuilders lining up performing the mandatory poses in front of judges. And who can forget the 1975 Mr. Olympia, as shown in the film Pumping Iron, where the organizer is calling out for 6 mandatory poses to Franco Columbu.
For comparison judging. Then they come on one at a time to perform the 6 compulsory poses that show every part of the body.
So I believe I have answered this question that was brought forth by Terence in a thorough manner, and in summary what I have discovered from this deep dive into the history of pre-judging and the 8 mandatory poses is that the 8 mandatory poses came from the practice of muscle control, which was used to display muscular development during physique competitions. Of that I have no doubt. It is clear that the competitors referenced muscle controls from the practice of maxalding to display their physiques, and I can imagine that with time, to allow for comparative analysis of each physique, the 8 mandatory poses were selected from these muscle controls. Secondly, how did these poses end up in the pre-judging phase of bodybuilding competition? It appears that pre-judging has existed since the beginning of bodybuilding competition, and the 8 mandatory poses were incorporated and were a prerequisite probably by either the late 60s and early 70s, or maybe even later. However, eventually they became a prerequisite throughout all bodybuilding competitions. So I do hope you have enjoyed this video on the history of pre-judging and the 8 mandatory poses. I really took the effort to look into this important part of bodybuilding history, and I hope that I have done the topic justice. If you have enjoyed this video, then please give the video a like, subscribe, and leave me your comments. I really like answering such important historical questions, so please keep them coming. Now, if you're interested in expanding your posing repertoire, I highly recommend joining my school community, where I have just started uploading Sandal's muscle control course. This series of lessons includes video demonstrations and in-depth lectures on muscle control, which were taught over 125 years ago. I also teach maxalding privately in my online coaching program, including advanced muscle controls like abdominal controls. So if you are interested, please see the links in the video description below. That's it from me. This is the Golden Era Bookworm saying bye for now. Head to www.goldenerabookworm.com for the biggest range of classic old school bodybuilding books as ebooks, e-magazines such as Iron Man and Reg Park Journal, high-quality bodybuilding posters of the Golden Era stars, merchandise and classic gymwear featuring Steve Reeves, Marvin Eder, John Grimmick, Reg Park, and many other Golden Era stars. For those wishing to build a classic physique, lose fat and build muscle, online training is also available. Collectibles such as rare autographed photos from the Golden Era stars are also available, and to collaborate, please get in touch. Now, if you're interested in learning more about Vince Gironda's approach to bodybuilding, his principles, and all these tips of wisdom that he has, I mean, there's so much stuff that probably hasn't been proven by science, and it will take science to prove or disprove Vince. But to be honest, these 3 books, I believe, which I call the Classic Physique Bundle, are the best books that Vince ever came out with. And they, of course, are the Wild Physique, the Master Series, and the Pro Series. Have a look at it this way. The Wild Physique, I believe, is like the ABCs of Vince Gironda's principles to bodybuilding. He teaches you the exercises and his principles. But how do you put them together? Well, the Master Series is a 14-month program of using all of these principles, all of the diets that Vince came out with, all of the exercises. And of course, the Pro Series was a book that he came out with later on, specially targeted for getting into competition. It's just these 3 books, as I call it, the Classic Physique Bundle, are Vince's best work, and available, of course, at www.goldenerabookworm.com.